A night in Victorian London, sleep through history. Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to Victorian London. So if you're settling into bed, dim the lights, let the room grow quiet, and allow your breathing to match the steady rhythm of the city at rest. The year hovers somewhere in the late 1800s. The air smells faintly of coal smoke and damp brick. Gas lamps glow like pale moons along the narrow streets. Nothing urgent will happen here. Just a slow wander through a city that thought it ruled the world, while its royals and politicians quietly unraveled behind velvet curtains. London after dark is never silent. There's the soft clop of a carriage, the occasional bark of a bored dog, the faint metallic hum of the Thames sliding under its bridges. We begin in Buckingham Palace. Naturally, because where else would you find the most anxious people in Britain pretending to be serene? Queen Victoria herself is somewhere upstairs. She is, as always, surrounded by portraits of Albert, her late husband and near-mythical obsession. It's been decades since he died of what was probably typhoid, and yet she still wears black like a professional mourner. Her children, 9 of them because subtlety was not the Victorian way, tiptoe around her moods. She has perfected the art of making silence feel like a lecture. Victoria believes in the sacredness of monarchy, with the intensity of a woman who never had to hail her own cab. She also believes her bloodline is special, which is awkward, because the family's genetics are, let's say, fragile. Haemophilia runs through them like an uninvited houseguest. One son, Leopold, inherited it, and his life became a careful negotiation between dignity and not bleeding too much when he sneezed. Let's drift to another corridor. There's Bertie, later Edward VII, her eldest son. He is technically heir to the throne, though Victoria treats him like a slightly disappointing side project. Bertie likes gambling, dinner parties, and women who are not his wife. He's built for leisure rather than spreadsheets of statecraft. Naturally, the more she scolds, the more he leans into his role as royal bon vivant. He will one day be king, largely by outliving his mother, which is harder than it sounds. Beyond Buckingham, the city itself pulses with contradictions. Industrial might sits beside cramped slums. The aristocracy dines on oysters, while half the East End wonders if bread will arrive tomorrow. Gaslights flicker over muddy streets, revealing horses, mud, and the occasional poet trying to look mysterious. Now, because no evening stroll is complete without a little family drama, we glide across the channel, at least metaphorically, to the tangled web of Victoria's relatives. She has seeded Europe's royal houses like a determined gardener. Her daughters marry into Germany, Russia, and Spain, carrying with them the same haemophiliac gene and a certain knack for awkward dinner conversations. Consider her granddaughter Alexandra, who marries the Russian heir Nicholas II. Alexandra will later cling to the mystic Rasputin as if he were a one-man pharmacy, hoping he can protect her haemophiliac son. You see the pattern. Royals love nothing more than marrying their cousins, and then acting surprised when recessive genes show up like uninvited guests. But we're still in London tonight. Listen to the quiet scrape of a watchman's boots on wet cobblestone. The Thames smells faintly of iron and regret. Somewhere a foghorn sighs. Inside the clubs of St. James's, gentlemen debate empire with the relaxed confidence of people who will never have to shovel coal themselves. The empire is enormous, which is mostly convenient for bragging over brandy. India, Canada, bits of Africa, they're all trophies on a map. And naturally, the decisions made here over cigars and under oil paintings will ripple outward in ways these men will never personally endure. Back at the palace, Victoria writes another letter to one of her many children, offering advice that is both imperious and oddly fussy. She signs it simply, "Your loving mama," a phrase that somehow manages to sound like a decree. Let's drift farther east, where Whitechapel's alleys are a different world. Gaslight barely reaches the ground. Residents share rooms with rats and with each other's coughs. It's not glamorous, but it is the heartbeat of the city. Above it all, Big Ben keeps steady time, indifferent to royal dramas and parliamentary speeches. The clock will tick long after the empire's maps have shrunk. As the night deepens, we return once more to the palace. Victoria, unable to sleep, summons a servant to read correspondence from yet another continental cousin. Somewhere in Germany, a minor duke has married someone equally minor, and she must know every detail. It is all part of her quiet strategy. Keep the bloodlines connected, even if that means the family tree begins to look like a tightly wound wreath. You can almost hear the soft scratch of her pen as she writes back, planning dynastic futures while the rest of the city dreams. And that's where we leave our first wander through Victorian London, unhurried, a little smoky, gently absurd. Let the gaslights fade. Let the quiet river keep moving. We'll drift to the next royal misadventure soon. I'll come back, still adrift in the soft haze of Victorian London. If you're already half asleep, that's perfect. Nothing here demands alertness. We'll simply continue to drift, the city's fog curling like a blanket around every stone facade. The palace remains hushed, but the family's reach stretches outward, and that's where we'll wander tonight. Because, of course, Queen Victoria's children could never simply stay put. They scattered across Europe like politely wrapped parcels of dynastic ambition. Each marriage was a political calculation, a way to keep the right thrones in friendly hands, though friendly is a generous word for a group of cousins who would eventually fight 2 world wars against each other. Take Princess Alice, Victoria's second daughter. She married Louis IV of Hesse, a German Grand Duke who combined earnestness with the charisma of damp wallpaper. Alice brought along the infamous haemophilia gene naturally, and their descendants would carry it forward like an awkward family heirloom. Her daughter Alex, later Empress Alexandra of Russia, inherited not just the gene, but a persistent belief that mystics might be good medical advisors. That belief would one day invite the famously unwashed Rasputin into the Russian court, because apparently hygiene and clairvoyance were unrelated in her mind. Let's glide south to Spain for a moment, where another of Victoria's brood, Princess Beatrice, also spread the family's delicate bloodline. Her marriage to Prince Henry of Battenberg was mildly controversial, mostly because Victoria disliked the idea of her youngest child living far away. She eventually allowed it, provided Beatrice never stopped writing detailed letters home, and so she did, dutifully reporting every minor detail like a royal stenographer with excellent penmanship. The men of the family were no less interesting, in the faintly disappointing way royals often are. Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh, travelled the world as a naval officer, a career choice that at least kept him out of immediate scandal. He married a Russian Grand Duchess, bringing the family tree into yet another elegant loop. Their gatherings were less family reunion and more United Nations with better hats. Back in London, the city hums with quieter stories. In Mayfair, the well-to-do return from late dinners, while the lamplighters finish their rounds, leaving a trail of warm glows behind them. Down in the East End, families settle into cramped rooms where the air tastes of soot and boiled cabbage. Life expectancy is a polite fiction here, but conversations still wander toward politics, wages, and the endless hope for something better. We drift for a moment toward Parliament. Inside, gentlemen in waistcoats debate the Empire's latest acquisitions, with the casual arrogance of men who never have to visit those faraway lands. India provides endless material, railway plans, taxation schemes, and the occasional awkward question about famine relief, questions quickly sidestepped over cups of strong tea. Because naturally, the Empire is both a moral duty and a convenient source of wealth. It depends on who is telling the story. Meanwhile, Queen Victoria records her thoughts in diary after diary. She writes of ministers, grandchildren, and occasionally the weather, all with the same stern precision. It's a private world where emotions are neatly pressed between pages, as if feelings might misbehave if left unbound. Let's return to the family for a moment because their minor misadventures are oddly soothing. Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught, dedicated himself to a military career with almost suspicious diligence. He served in India and Canada, making him one of the few royals who actually travelled beyond the ceremonial carriage route. He married Princess Louise Margaret of Prussia, another cousin, because of course he did. Their marriage was relatively calm, an achievement that in this family counts as an event. Not everyone stayed so steady. Prince Leopold, the haemophiliac son, struggled with the limitations of his condition. He loved music and the arts, but a simple fall could become dangerous. Despite this, he insisted on living as normally as possible, which in royal terms meant long discussions about art, politics, and carefully supervised walks. He eventually married Princess Helena of Waldeck and Pyrmont, producing 2 children before his health betrayed him at age 30. His quiet persistence stands out like a gentle footnote amid louder royal dramas. Beyond the palaces, the empire's edges press inward. Telegrams arrive daily from colonies describing uprisings, trade routes, and the occasional disastrous expedition. The information travels faster than ever, thanks to undersea cables and relentless clerks. London sits at the center of a web so wide it seems almost imaginary. Night deepens. The bells of St. Paul's murmur through the fog. Somewhere, a newspaper press clatters, sending early editions towards sleepy vendors. The city never truly rests, yet it feels unhurried when viewed from this quiet vantage. Victoria herself finally drifts to bed, though not without ceremony. Servants move like ghosts, drawing curtains and checking locks. Her beloved little dog, a Pomeranian named Turi, curls at her feet. Even the queen of a global empire needs a warm, breathing creature nearby. We glide once more through silent corridors, past portraits of ancestors who all believed they were the linchpin of history. Their painted eyes follow, solemn and faintly judgmental. Outside, the fog thickens until the city becomes a watercolor of lights and shadow. This is where we leave our second gentle wander. The Thames continues its slow conversation with the sea. The empire sleeps in its own uneasy dream, and the royal family, ever complicated, ever entangled, waits for another day to unfold. The reluctant heirs and the restless city, the night stretches deeper over London. A quiet ink wash across slate rooftops. Gas lamps still burn with their pale amber halos, but the streets have thinned to a slow scatter of cab wheels and the occasional stray cat. The city settles, though never entirely sleeps. Inside the palace, the royal household breathes in its own careful rhythm. Beyond the gates, the empire's heartbeat continues, steady, enormous, and faintly ridiculous. Let's move again through the family tree, because it is impossible to drift through Victorian London without stumbling over another royal child or cousin with a story worth at least a wry glance. There is Princess Louise, the 4th daughter, who resisted the usual arrangement of marrying a continental prince. Naturally, this was viewed as faintly scandalous, because heaven forbid a royal woman should marry for anything resembling affection. Louise possessed a streak of independent thought that confounded the court. She sculpted, painted, and had opinions that were not delivered in a whisper. In 1871, she married John Campbell, the Marquess of Lorne, a mere British noble rather than a crowned head. The match was presented as sensible, but everyone knew it was mildly rebellious. Rumors of affairs hovered for years, drifting through salons like cigarette smoke, never quite confirmed and never quite denied. Her brother Leopold admired her resolve. He too wanted a life outside the scripted corridors of royalty. His haemophilia made every movement a negotiation, but he insisted on travel and conversation and art. He read widely, debated politics, and lived as though the fragile thread of his health might hold indefinitely. It did not, of course. A fall in Cannes ended his story early, another quiet entry in the family's long record of delicate blood and premature farewells. While the royal household managed its dramas behind closed doors, the city itself wrestled with change. Industry had reshaped the skyline. New railway stations were vast cathedrals of iron and steam. Clerks and merchants moved with brisk purpose through the day, while at night those same stations exhaled heat into the cool air, a steady reminder of London's restless modernity. The Thames, ever patient, carried away the day's refuse and secrets. Barges slid past darkened wharves. Overhead, bridges stood solid and slightly damp, stone sentinels watching the slow current. The river had seen every version of London, from plague years to coronations, and regarded them all with the same calm indifference. Inside drawing rooms across the West End, the Empire remained the favoured topic of conversation. Maps hung on walls like trophies. Lines of red ink stretched across continents. India, Canada, Australia, Africa, names spoken with easy entitlement, as though they were merely extensions of an island's ambition. Debates over colonial policy filled newspapers and parlours alike. Should the Crown tighten its grip on distant provinces? Should trade be freer, taxation heavier, administrators sterner? Each opinion was delivered over tea and cake, safely far from the lives those decisions would disrupt. The Queen herself, though aging, remained the unshakable centre. Victoria's mourning clothes had long since faded from deep black to a softer charcoal, but she wore them still, a permanent emblem of loss and authority. Ministers came and went. Prime ministers rose and retired, but she persisted. Her handwriting, firm and upright, filled diary after diary with observations both grand and trivial. She might record a political shift with the same precision she gave to the description of a garden bloom. Her eldest son, Bertie, the future Edward VII, continued to provide quiet frustration. He loved society, gambling and conversation that occasionally skirted the edge of propriety. His friendships were numerous, his discretion less so. Yet for all the gossip, he maintained a curious charm. People liked him. Even those who disapproved of his habits admitted his easy manner. Victoria, naturally, viewed this with a mixture of resignation and imperial sighing. She wanted discipline. Bertie offered conviviality. History would eventually show that his sociable style suited a new century better than her stern example. Across the Channel, royal cousins observed and occasionally meddled. Germany's rising power brought family ties into awkward relief. Victoria's eldest daughter, also named Victoria and married to the German Crown Prince Frederick, lived at the heart of this emerging force. Their son, the future Kaiser Wilhelm II, inherited not just a love of ceremony, but a complicated mix of admiration and resentment toward his British relatives. He wrote letters filled with alternating warmth and critique, as though uncertain whether he wished to embrace or outshine the family that had given him half his blood. In Russia, granddaughter Alexandra settled uneasily into life as empress. She carried her English grandmother's strong will and her mother Alice's haemophilia gene, a pairing that would shape the twilight of the Romanovs. Her devotion to her son, the fragile Tsarevich Alexei, drew her toward the mystic Rasputin, whose influence would one day scandalize the empire. For now, though, these were quiet beginnings, threads not yet woven into the violent tapestry of revolution. London, meanwhile, expanded outward, swallowing villages and fields in a slow tide of brick. Suburbs sprouted rail stations like mushrooms after rain. Clerks rode out each evening to modest houses where gardens struggled against soot. Children played in narrow lanes until the lamplighter's glow called them home. The city's pulse, once confined within ancient walls, now stretched to the horizon. Night workers kept their own schedule. Bakers kneaded dough for the morning rush. Printers fed presses that chattered like restless birds. Policemen walked their beats, boots scuffing softly against damp stone. Somewhere a dog barked at nothing in particular. Somewhere else a poet stared at an unfinished line, the gaslight guttering above his desk. Through it all, the monarchy remained both symbol and spectacle. The public followed royal events with a mixture of admiration and weary amusement. Newspapers printed every engagement, every illness, every whispered rumor. When a princess sneezed, someone inevitably speculated about her diet. When a duke traveled, maps appeared in the next day's edition to trace his route. The people might complain about taxes and rents, but many still found comfort in the familiar drama of the crown. Victoria understood this in her own stern way. She believed in duty, in the quiet performance of stability. Even her personal sorrows, Albert's death, the loss of children and grandchildren, were folded into a public narrative of endurance. She became, over the years, less a person than a national emblem, a figure at once deeply human and curiously untouchable. As the small hours approach, the city seems to exhale. Markets fall silent. Taverns release their last patrons, who stagger homeward under a misty moon. The palace windows darken one by one until only a few faint glimmers remain. Somewhere inside, a night watchman adjusts the timepiece that keeps the household on schedule. The empire sleeps, though not peacefully. In distant colonies, local uprisings flicker like far-off lightning. Traders haggle by lantern light in ports half a world away. Telegrams will carry news of it all to London by morning, compressed into clipped phrases and urgent signatures. For now, only the river speaks, a low, endless murmur beneath the bridges. Big Ben marks the hours with patient chimes. Fog softens the edges of the world until even the sharp spires of Westminster fade into watercolour. If you listen closely, you might imagine the faint scratch of Victoria's pen, finishing a late entry in her diary. Perhaps she notes the weather, mild, damp, a hint of spring despite the winter date. Perhaps she writes of a grandchild's letter or of Bertie's latest minor indiscretion. Or perhaps she writes nothing at all, letting silence fill the space where words might have been. And so the night continues, vast and unhurried. The royal family sleeps behind heavy curtains. London rests in its sprawling patchwork of wealth and want. The empire dreams of permanence, unaware that every empire eventually wakes to a different morning. The lamps burn lower, the streets empty further. The river keeps moving, steady and indifferent, as it has through plague, fire, and the endless passage of kings and queens. Let that quiet carry you, the gentle hum of a city that once called itself the center of the world, now simply breathing under a veil of fog. Shadows of inheritance. The fog lingers over London, like a wool blanket left out overnight, muffling every sound except the soft lap of the Thames. Somewhere far upriver, an early barge moves against the tide, its slow engine a heartbeat for the city. The palace remains sealed in its own measured stillness, but the wider royal family is forever in motion, crossing borders, marrying cousins, writing letters that read like carefully folded chess moves. Tonight, we drift toward the question that haunted every European throne in the late 19th century. Who exactly would inherit the crowns when the current wearers finally surrendered them to time? Victoria's brood had filled Europe with potential heirs, each carrying fragments of her features, her stubbornness, and, too often, her problematic genes. Consider the case of Prince George of Wales, Bertie's second son and the future George V. As a child, he showed little interest in grandeur. His schooling focused more on naval training than political theory, and he seemed perfectly content at sea, where protocol meant keeping the deck clean rather than balancing parliamentary factions. He was reserved, almost shy, and possessed a beard that grew into a permanent emblem of British respectability. When duty eventually forced him to trade ocean breezes for ceremonial carriages, he did so with quiet reluctance. Naturally, that made him rather good at it. His elder brother, Prince Albert Victor, known as Eddie, was another story. Eddie occupied the unenviable position of heir to the heir, and his personality fit the role of mild puzzle. Descriptions of him range from charmingly vague to worryingly vague. He was polite, yes, and apparently pleasant, but with a dreamy absence that made tutors sigh and politicians squint. Rumours later tied him to every scandalous whisper of the era, from clandestine clubs to dark crimes in Whitechapel, none of which survived serious scrutiny. He died young of pneumonia, which neatly ended the speculation and quietly handed the throne in waiting to his steadier brother George. A transition of power by cough rather than coup. Farther along the family branches, marriages continued to knit Europe into a single overcomplicated tapestry. Princess Helena married the German-born Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein, which sounded grand enough to require extra stationery. Their life was dutiful but unremarkable, an ongoing lesson that not every royal pairing produces fireworks. Sometimes it just produces more committees. They raised their children amid the polite boredom of small court society, sending occasional updates to Victoria, who no doubt catalogued each child's progress with the same precision she gave to garden reports. Princess Beatrice, the youngest, remained Victoria's constant companion long after her sisters had departed for foreign courts. The Queen treated her as a private secretary disguised as a daughter. Beatrice accepted the role with quiet grace, managing correspondence, reading aloud, and serving as a living bridge between Victoria and the outside world. When she finally married Prince Henry of Battenberg, she negotiated a rare arrangement. She and her husband would live with the Queen. The compromise pleased almost no one except Victoria, who gained a son-in-law and kept her favorite child under the same roof. Meanwhile, the world beyond the palaces kept shifting. The Industrial Revolution, once a brash newcomer, had matured into daily routine. Factories hummed into the night, their chimneys smudging the horizon. Telegraphs carried messages faster than a horse could gallop, faster even than the fog could swallow them. London became a city of connections, rails, wires, shipping lanes, each one tying the empire a little tighter. This network carried not only trade, but trouble. News of colonial unrest arrived with unsettling speed. In India, political discontent simmered beneath the surface pageantry of the Raj. In Africa, Britain's scramble for territory created lines on maps that ignored the people who lived there. Debates in Parliament grew sharper, though rarely louder. Englishmen preferred their arguments delivered in measured tones over tea. Through it all, Queen Victoria held her course. Her diaries from these years reveal a woman increasingly aware of her own mortality, yet unwilling to relinquish control. She recorded state matters, family gossip, and small domestic details with equal gravity. Her grandson's illness might appear on the same page as the appointment of a colonial governor, both given the same tidy handwriting and unruffled phrasing. In the drawing rooms of London, society watchers speculated on what the next century would bring. Would Bertie's eventual reign soften the monarchy's stern edges? Would the empire expand forever, or had it already reached its comfortable limit? Most agreed on one thing. The royal family, for all its quirks, provided a familiar anchor in an age of dizzying change. The city itself breathed around them, vast and layered. New suburbs stretched outward like patient tides. Horse-drawn omnibuses clattered along newly paved streets. Markets bustled at dawn, emptied by afternoon, and filled again by evening vendors. In the East End, families crowded into tenements, their lives largely untouched by the polished ceremonies of the court. Children played in alleys lit by the weak flicker of gas, their laughter mixing with the distant rumble of trains. Night settled deeper, folding these contrasts together. From the riverbanks one could see the glow of countless lamps, rich man's chandelier and poor man's candle blending into a single haze. Big Ben marked the hours with a patient inevitability, each chime a reminder that time moved on regardless of royal weddings or parliamentary debates. Back inside Buckingham Palace, the Queen prepared for another carefully ordered evening. Letters were answered, reports reviewed, a final diary entry composed. Perhaps she noted the weather again, or a minor political appointment, or the steady progress of a grandchild's education. Her small Pomeranian, faithful as ever, likely dozed at her feet, the quietest witness to the closing of another imperial day. The wider family, those scattered cousins and children who filled Europe's palaces, also settled into their own nighttime routines. Some planned journeys, some whispered to lovers, some stared at ceilings heavy with the weight of expectation. They were at once ordinary and impossibly privileged, living proof that history often favors the accidental birthright over any deliberate virtue. London exhaled a final plume of fog as the last carriages found their stables. The river continued its dark conversation with the sea. The empire, for all its restless ambition, slept beneath the same indifferent stars as every other land. And the heirs, reluctant, uncertain, or quietly determined, waited for a future they did not entirely choose, bound together by bloodlines as tangled as the city's own web of streets. Fading footsteps of an endless reign, the small hours belong to the city's quiet workers. Milk carts creak over damp cobbles. Bakers tend their fires, faces warm and flour-dusted. A lamplighter makes his last round, checking wicks with the calm of someone who knows every street by scent and sound. London exhales in slow clouds of coal-tinged breath. Inside the royal palaces, the air is just as still, though the weight of empire never truly sleeps. Queen Victoria rises earlier than most imagine. Even in her 70s, she clings to the discipline of dawn. A lady-in-waiting brings tea, careful not to clink the porcelain. The Queen reads dispatches while the city still lies under its grey blanket of fog. Her handwriting remains firm, as if she could keep history itself in line by sheer neatness. Her face is familiar across the globe, reproduced on coins, stamps, and the occasional poorly drawn newspaper sketch. Children in Canada, soldiers in India, clerks in New Zealand all handle her profile every day. It is the quiet magic of print and currency, an empire stitched together not just by ships and soldiers, but by a single, unblinking portrait. Yet for all the grandeur, the royal household hums with ordinary concerns. Meals must be planned, accounts checked, grandchildren catalogued. The Queen inquires after the health of a pony, the progress of a gardener, the precise shade of a new curtain. Power and domesticity blend without contradiction. She never saw a reason they shouldn't. Her children, meanwhile, drift further outward. Bertie travels constantly, a man determined to socialize an empire into cohesion. His tours are a steady blur of dinners, cigars, and tactful speeches. Where Victoria is granite, Bertie is velvet, easier to approach, though he occasionally leaves scandal in his wake. Yet even his most questionable adventures cannot dent his public popularity. People simply like him. It is a talent not taught in royal manuals. Princess Louise continues her art, sculpting in studios that smell faintly of damp plaster. Critics debate whether her work stands on its own or merely benefits from her title. She shrugs at the question and keeps chiseling. Princess Beatrice still manages her mother's correspondence with quiet precision, a human buffer between Victoria and the endless petitions that arrive by each morning's post. Across the Channel, the grandchildren grow into their destined roles. Wilhelm in Germany sharpens his ambition, forever measuring himself against the British relatives he half envies, half resents. In Russia, Alexandra leans harder on faith and mysticism as her fragile son struggles with the haemophilia that winds like a pale thread through the dynasty. Each branch of the family tree bends under its own peculiar weather. London itself changes beneath their feet. Electric lights begin to replace gas, glowing whiter, steadier, a hint of a new century. Telephones whisper across town, their copper wires hidden yet everywhere. Horse-drawn omnibuses share the roads with early motorcars, whose engines cough like ill-tempered dogs. Progress arrives not with fanfare, but with a low, persistent hum. The empire's edges remain restless. South Africa simmers. Ireland murmurs of independence. Ministers debate these troubles in rooms thick with cigar smoke. Their voices calm, their choices rarely so. Victoria reads every report, adding her own careful marginal notes. She does not travel to these distant corners. Her body is tired, the journey's too long, but she insists on knowing, on deciding. Night folds back in. A light rain drifts across the palace gardens, carrying the smell of wet stone and early roses. Servants move through corridors like well-trained shadows. Somewhere a clock strikes 3, the sound softened by heavy curtains. The Queen closes her diary for the evening. Another entry joins decades of meticulous record, small domestic observations beside affairs of state. Few people will ever read these pages, yet she writes as though posterity peers over her shoulder. Beyond the gates, London settles again. Markets lie empty. Cats claim the deserted lanes. The river slides beneath the bridges, dark and indifferent, carrying yesterday into tomorrow. The monarchy endures by such quiet habits. No grand declaration, only the slow persistence of routine. Tea poured at dawn, documents signed with an unwavering hand, a nation held together by ceremony as much as policy. It is an empire of details, of tiny acts repeated until they feel inevitable. When dawn finally tints the fog with a muted silver, the city will stir. Carriages will return, newsboys will shout headlines, and another day of empire will begin, exactly as the last ended, steady, unhurried, a little absurd in its grandeur. For now, let the night keep its hold. The Queen rests, the heirs dream, and the Thames moves on, patient as history itself. The waning century, the first hints of dawn are still a rumour when London begins to stir. In the east, a faint pearl grey washes over chimney stacks, softening the black outline of slate rooftops. The fog has thinned but not vanished. It lingers like a patient houseguest, wrapping the city in a quiet, damp hush. Carters begin their slow clatter toward the markets, hooves striking wet stone with a rhythm older than empire. Newspapers roll from presses, ink still damp, headlines already arguing with each other. Inside Buckingham Palace, the corridors remain subdued. But the Queen is awake. She has never needed much sleep, a trait that delights her secretaries and terrifies her household. A tray of tea arrives before the servants have fully shaken off their own dreams. Victoria reads the morning dispatches with the calm efficiency of someone accustomed to seeing half the world's affairs condensed to a handful of pages. Ministers know better than to deliver flowery prose. She prefers facts, even when the facts are awkward. Awkwardness, in fact, has become the century's favourite pastime. The empire stands enormous, but the cracks show. Ireland is restless again, as it has been for generations. In South Africa, the Boers argue over land and independence, with a stubbornness that defies easy telegrams. India, jewel of the imperial crown, grows more politically alert with each passing year. Yet from this quiet room, the Queen reads every report as though distance were an inconvenience that can be tamed by ink. Her children, those 9 sources of both pride and mild exasperation, are scattered across Europe like well-dressed chess pieces. Bertie, the indefatigable Prince of Wales, tours the continent with his trademark blend of charm and selective attention to detail. He gambles, he dines, he exchanges jokes that would horrify his mother if repeated in her hearing. Somehow, despite every rumour, the public adores him. Perhaps they find his indiscretions comfortingly human after decades of Victoria's granite virtue. George, Bertie's younger son, and now the quiet heir after brother Eddie's death, continues his naval career with the steady discipline of a man who would rather chart a course by the stars than by Parliament. His wife, Mary of Teck, practical and composed, writes him letters full of careful affection and household trivia. Their life is almost ordinary, which in royal terms is nearly revolutionary. Elsewhere, the family tree twists into more dramatic shapes. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II grows louder and more impatient. He writes letters to his grandmother Victoria, full of backhanded praise, alternating between flattery and barely veiled ambition. His left arm, withered from a birth injury, has not softened his appetite for grandeur. He sees Germany's future as something forged by willpower and steel, and he carries the peculiar certainty that Britain should either applaud or step aside. The family dinners of the future promise to be lively, if not entirely civil. In St. Petersburg, granddaughter Alexandra clings ever tighter to her faith and to the fragile health of her son, the Tsarevich Alexei. The boy's haemophilia, an unkind inheritance from his British ancestors, has already shaped the Russian court. Doctors whisper, priests pray, and into this anxious vacuum steps the wandering mystic Rasputin, whose reputation for both holiness and alarming personal habits travels faster than any official envoy. For now, these are merely ripples on a quiet sea, but history with its fondness for irony is already sharpening its quill. Back in London, the city itself hums with a new century's pulse. Electric lights glow steadier and whiter than the old gas lamps, casting sharp-edged shadows on brick and stone. Telephones ring in offices where clerks once relied on errand boys. Motorcars cough down narrow lanes, scattering pedestrians who are still unsure whether to treat them as marvels or nuisances. Shops display imported goods from every corner of the empire: tea from Ceylon, cotton from India, curiosities from Africa. Londoners accept this global reach as casually as they accept the weather, though both remain beyond their control. Among the working classes, life improves in increments rather than leaps. Public sanitation has chased away the worst of the cholera years. Education reforms mean more children in school and fewer in factories, though poverty keeps its grip on many neighborhoods. In Whitechapel and Limehouse, families still crowd into rooms where the air tastes of smoke and boiled cabbage. Yet even here, change is visible: a new public library, a clinic run by determined nurses, a streetlight burning late enough for a child to finish a borrowed book. Victoria notices these shifts, though she records them in the same measured tones she applies to everything else. Her diaries remain a mix of statecraft and small domestic detail, a minister's resignation beside a note on the garden's first snowdrop. She has always believed that history is built from such juxtapositions. Her own longevity has become a symbol, an unbroken thread linking the faded world of her youth to the electric restlessness of the present. The Queen travels less now. Her joints complain, and the endless rituals of public appearances grow wearisome. Yet she remains a presence. When she does venture out, to a ceremony, a review of troops, the crowds respond with a quiet awe. They cheer not the spectacle but the sheer endurance. A monarch who has outlived not only her beloved Albert, but nearly everyone who first bowed before her. She has become, in the public imagination, almost geological, part of the landscape, as inevitable as the Thames. Bertie waits, not always patiently, for the day he will finally be king. He masks his anticipation with social whirl and constant travel, but those close to him see the flicker of restlessness. He knows the crown will be his only by the natural erosion of time, and time, though reliable, takes its own pace. Night falls again, drawing the city into a softer outline. Electric lamps glow through thin mist. The river reflects their light in slow ripples. From Parliament a final carriage departs, wheels echoing along the embankment. Somewhere a newsboy calls the late edition, his voice sharp against the hush. Inside the palace, the Queen writes one more entry before bed. Perhaps she mentions the day's mild rain or the telegram from a distant governor. Perhaps she pauses, pen hovering, aware that each word now feels closer to an ending. She has lived through reform bills, revolutions abroad, and the steady march of invention from steam engine to telephone. Her own life has become the measure of an era. Servants move with careful quiet, extinguishing lamps, drawing heavy curtains. The Pomeranian settles at the foot of the royal bed, a small, warm presence amid the chill of stone walls. Beyond those walls, the empire stretches across oceans. But here the night is intimate, the sound of a ticking clock, the faint rustle of fabric as a maid withdraws. The Thames continues its patient conversation with the sea. Its tide has carried plague barges, warships, and endless cargoes of ambition. Tonight it carries only the soft glow of moonlight, broken now and then by the silhouette of a passing boat. The city sleeps, and for a few hours the empire seems almost peaceful. Morning will bring more telegrams, more debates, more of the quiet endurance that defines Victoria's reign. But for now, London rests in a liminal space, neither the soot-dark Victorian capital of her youth nor the glittering electric metropolis it is becoming. The century wanes, and the Queen, still watchful, drifts toward another day. The last quiet season, winter settles like a muted shawl across the Isle of Wight. The gardens at Osborne House lie damp and colourless, save for the stubborn green of ivy clinging to stone. The Solent, that narrow body of water the Queen has watched for decades, rolls under a pewter sky. Ships move at a distance, their outlines soft in the haze, as though the world itself has chosen to speak in whispers. Victoria remains in residence, her household adjusting to the slow rhythm of an aging monarch. Servants tread carefully on thick carpets, carrying trays of tea and envelopes of official correspondence. They keep their voices low, partly out of respect, partly because the house itself seems to demand it. Every room holds the weight of memory. Albert's favorite chair, the portraits of children who are now grey-haired themselves, the endless rows of books chosen over half a century. The Queen's days begin later now. The stiff ache in her joints makes rising an unhurried business. A lady-in-waiting brings the morning papers, already folded to the most significant articles. There are reports of unrest in South Africa, discussions in Parliament about military budgets, and the usual speculation about alliances on the continent. Victoria reads with the same keen eye she has always brought to politics, though her comments these days are more concise, as if words themselves have grown heavier. Family letters arrive in steady bundles. Bertie writes dutifully, mixing polite updates with the occasional note of genuine concern. He remains the perennial heir, carrying himself with the assurance of a man who has waited his entire adult life for a role that refuses to arrive. George and Mary send news of their young children, their language plain and comforting. Other grandchildren write from Germany, Russia, Denmark. Each dispatch a small reminder of how far the family tree now spreads and how entangled it has become in Europe's restless politics. Victoria receives these letters with a measured affection. She has always loved her family in her own practical way, a love expressed through advice, admonition, and an almost bureaucratic sense of duty. Yet in these final seasons, a gentler note emerges. She lingers over photographs of great-grandchildren, traces a fingertip along their smiling faces, and sometimes allows a small private smile. Outside the palace walls, the world keeps quickening. Motor cars appear in greater numbers on London streets, each coughing engine a small mechanical rebellion against the centuries of horse-drawn tradition. Electric trams carry workers across the city, their sparks flickering against the evening mist. Wireless telegraphy, once a curiosity, begins to stitch distant colonies more tightly into the imperial network. Even as her own pace slows, Victoria presides over a nation that is learning to move faster than ever. The Queen notices these changes but does not chase them. Her mind remains sharp, but she has no need for the novelty of gadgets or the thrill of speed. Progress, she understands, will arrive whether she applauds it or not. She simply records it, noting dates and impressions in the same diaries that have followed her since youth. A century of ink and paper has made her life one of the most carefully documented in history, though she writes not for historians, but for herself, a quiet habit of order amid the chaos of empire. Evenings at Osborne grow quieter still. Gone are the grand dinners and lively musicals of earlier decades. Now the household gathers for simple meals, conversation subdued but companionable. Afterward, Victoria may sit by the fire with a trusted companion, perhaps a granddaughter reading aloud in a soft, steady voice. The Queen listens, occasionally nodding, her thoughts half in the present and half wandering through a gallery of memories. Albert's laughter, the first cries of newborn children, the solemn faces of ministers long since buried. Her health, never robust, begins to falter in small but insistent ways. There are spells of fatigue, a shortness of breath after even modest exertion. Physicians arrive with their bags of tonics and polite concern, offering advice she accepts with a mixture of patience and mild irritation. She has outlasted so many of their predecessors that medical authority no longer impresses her. Still, she endures their examinations, if only to reassure anxious family members. News from abroad continues its steady march of unease. In South Africa, the Boer conflict drags on, each skirmish reported in crisp telegrams that belie the human cost. Europe watches Germany's naval ambitions with wary eyes. In Russia, Alexandra's dependence on Rasputin deepens, a quiet thread of uncertainty that will one day become a noose. Victoria reads these developments with calm detachment. She has witnessed too many crises to be easily rattled. Night falls early in winter. The house settles into its gentle creaks and sighs. Somewhere a clock chimes, its sound both reassuring and faintly solemn. Victoria sits near the window, wrapped in a shawl, watching the last streak of pale light fade across the water. The scene is almost perfectly still. The sea, the distant lights of passing ships, the occasional cry of a seabird carried on cold air. Servants light the lamps, their glow softer than the new electric bulbs she tolerates, but does not particularly like. She prefers the warmth of candlelight, the way it softens edges and forgives the wear of age. A small Pomeranian curls at her feet, a living ember of comfort. Letters and papers rest on the nearby table, but she does not reach for them. Instead, she remains quiet, the weight of nearly an entire century gathered in her steady gaze. There is no drama in these final months, only the gradual narrowing of days. Friends visit when weather allows. Ministers call, bow, and depart with carefully chosen words of respect. The nation watches from a polite distance, aware that an era is drawing to a close, but unwilling to speak of it too loudly. It is not grief yet, only a collective pause, as though the country itself holds its breath. When Victoria finally retires each night, the corridors dim to a hushed amber. The household follows a choreography perfected over decades. The rustle of skirts, the muted snap of extinguished wicks, the soft click of doors. Outside, the tide continues its timeless pull beneath the moon. The empire sleeps, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to admit, how near it stands to the end of its longest reign. And so the winter deepens. The Queen remains, small but resolute, a figure at once ordinary and immense. Her presence has become the quiet heartbeat of a century, steady and unhurried, even as the world around her leans toward a faster age. In the silence of Osborne House, history waits with patient inevitability, like the sea against the shore, gentle, persistent, and certain of the dawn. The soft approach of an ending. The calendar turns to January, and the new century feels more certain of itself. Across Britain, newspapers print grand words about progress and the boundless future. But in the quiet rooms of Osborne House, the mood is hushed and deliberate. The Queen rises later each morning, her movements slower, each gesture carrying the weight of nearly 90 years. Servants follow the familiar rituals with extra care. The footman who brings her tea speaks in near whispers. The lady-in-waiting smooths the bedclothes with a kind of reverence, as though the linens themselves might break if disturbed. They all sense what no one says aloud. The long reign is reaching its final stretch. Victoria notices it too, though she does not dwell on the obvious. She still dictates letters to ministers, still asks after troop movements and parliamentary votes. But her voice, once firm enough to unsettle a cabinet, now carries the softness of someone half-turned toward another world. Even her famously sharp opinions arrive in fewer words, as if she has decided that silence is often the best argument. Outside, winter clings to the Isle of Wight. The gardens sleep under a brittle frost. Their branches rattle when the wind sweeps in from the Solent. Ships pass at a distance, their lights blinking in the grey like careful signals. The sea itself seems subdued, each wave rolling in with patient inevitability. Letters continue to arrive from the far corners of the family. Bertie writes with a steadiness that surprises even him, offering gentle assurances instead of his usual gossip. George sends reports of naval duties and the health of the children. From Berlin, Wilhelm's telegrams are unusually restrained, almost tender. Even the famously brash Kaiser senses that the time for grand statements has passed. The Queen reads each message with quiet concentration. Her eyes tire more quickly now, and a lady-in-waiting often finishes the task, reading aloud in a low, even tone. Victoria listens, nodding at small details. Weather in Germany, a child's new tooth, a successful parliamentary vote. Yet her thoughts wander. Memories surface with the ease of long practice. Albert's smile, the cries of infants who have themselves become grandparents, the faces of ministers she once scolded into competence. Doctors visit daily. They speak of heart strain and a growing weakness in the lungs. but their voices carry more sympathy than authority. The Queen, who has outlived most of their mentors, regards their prescriptions with mild courtesy. She knows, as they surely know, that medicine can only mark the stages of a journey it cannot halt. Evenings have grown especially still. Dinner is simple: clear broth, soft bread, a fruit compote if she feels inclined. Conversation drifts like low mist. Afterward, she sits in her favorite chair by the window, shawl around her shoulders, a small dog curled against her feet. Sometimes she asks for music, something quiet, perhaps a hymn Albert once favored. Other nights she simply watches the horizon fade to black. London continues its restless life beyond the sea. Telegrams carry news of Parliament, of small colonial skirmishes, of the continuing Boer conflict. But here at Osborne, the urgency of empire seems faint and far away. The Queen, who once ruled with iron practicality, now rules mostly by memory and the force of an enduring symbol. The nation feels her presence even in her silence. Visitors arrive in careful succession. Bertie makes the crossing, bringing with him a mix of filial duty and the awareness that soon the crown will rest on his head. He walks the corridors softly, speaking with doctors, pausing by his mother's chair to take her hand. There are no grand speeches between them, only small words of comfort, the sort that carry more weight than any ceremony. Grandchildren gather as weather allows. They bring small gifts, sketches from travels, pressed flowers, letters folded with awkward precision. Victoria receives them with a faint smile, her eyes bright for a moment, as each familiar face leans close. The room fills with the quiet rustle of youth, a gentle echo of the bustling nursery she once oversaw. Outside, night settles early. The lamps in the hallway cast long amber streaks on polished floors. Servants move like shadows, their steps softened by years of practice. The house itself seems to exhale, every timber and panel aware of the slow, inevitable change approaching. The Queen sleeps more now, sometimes for hours in the middle of the day. She dreams, though she seldom speaks of what she sees. When she wakes, she asks for simple things: a sip of tea, a view of the sea, a favorite hymn quietly hummed by a companion. Her voice, when it comes, is faint but calm, carrying none of the fear others might expect. Beyond Osborne, the Empire continues its endless business. Factories in Manchester belch smoke. Telegraph lines hum with messages between continents. Soldiers patrol distant colonies, their boots stirring red dust under foreign suns. But all that movement seems far removed from the soft ticking of the clock in the Queen's chamber. As another evening drapes itself across the Solent, the household prepares for rest. Curtains are drawn, lamps lowered. A single coal fire glows in the grate, sending slow shadows up the walls. The air smells faintly of salt and ash. From somewhere deep in the house comes the muted sound of a hymn, a servant's quiet offering. Victoria closes her eyes, not in surrender but in a kind of peaceful observation. She has been a daughter, a young queen, a widow, a matriarch, an empress. She has read dispatches from every corner of the globe, signed laws that reshape nations, and lived to see the unimaginable become commonplace. Now she simply rests, the long arc of her life bending gently toward its natural conclusion. No proclamation marks the moment, no trumpet sounds, only the slow rhythm of breath, the hush of a loyal household, and the timeless murmur of the sea beyond the window. History waits just outside the door, patient as ever, ready to record the final sentences of a reign that has spanned an age. The final watch January deepens, and Osborne House grows stiller by the day. The winter air carries a clean salt scent from the Solent, drifting through corridors, no longer bustling with routine. Servants speak in near murmurs, their movements careful, as though even the floorboards might complain. Each hour feels stretched, measured, the quiet weight of expectation settling like dust on every surface. Queen Victoria spends more time in bed now, propped by pillows that once travelled with her between palaces. The diaries that recorded decades of diligence remain on a nearby table, though the pages stay blank these last mornings. Her eyes, once quick to catch a misplaced comma in a minister's report, close often and without warning. She wakes to short conversations, brief sips of tea, and the muted comfort of familiar voices. Family members arrive in steady procession. Bertie keeps vigil, moving between his mother's chamber and the draughty hallways, his usual bonhomie replaced by a quiet, watchful patience. George sits for long stretches beside her, reading softly when she stirs, his naval steadiness a silent anchor. Grandchildren tiptoe in and out, their faces a blend of solemn curiosity and unspoken awe. Even Kaiser Wilhelm crosses the channel, uncharacteristically subdued, to stand at his grandmother's bedside. Doctors confer in corners, speaking the language of careful inevitability. They adjust pillows, check pulses, and trade glances that confirm what all present already know. No sudden crisis announces itself, only the slow, gentle fading of strength. For a monarch who has lived by deliberate rhythm, this quiet decline seems almost fitting. Outside, the world keeps its own schedule. London newspapers debate the empire's next century with characteristic certainty. Factories hum, telegrams fly, and parliaments argue as though time is infinite. Yet on the Isle of Wight the hours pass in a soft suspension, each one carrying a little more silence. Night after night the Queen rests as attendants keep their vigil. The lamplight remains low, casting long amber reflections on polished wood. The house creaks with the shifting tide, an old companion sound that blends with the faint murmur of the sea. At times she murmurs a few words, memories of Albert, names of children, a blessing for the realm. At other times, she simply breathes, steady and calm, her presence filling the room without effort. On the evening of January 21st, the household gathers more tightly. A damp wind presses against the windows. Inside, shawls and quiet prayers ward off the chill. The Queen's breathing grows lighter, a slow retreat from the world she has shaped for more than 6 decades. Bertie holds her hand. Wilhelm stands near, uncharacteristically still. There are no proclamations, no sudden drama, only the inevitable grace of an ending. When morning comes, the first pale light reveals a nation changed. The longest reign in British history has quietly closed, leaving the island and the empire to absorb the news. Church bells will toll, newspapers will print in heavy type, and crowds will gather in the streets. But here in Osborne the moment is simple. A room of family, a faint scent of salt air, the hush of servants who have given their entire lives to service. The body of the Queen lies surrounded by flowers from her own gardens, violets, primroses, and a few late roses coaxed from glasshouse warmth. A small Pomeranian sits at the foot of the bed, patient as ever. Outside, the sea continues its patient rhythm, indifferent yet strangely companionable, as if it too understands the passing of an age. Far beyond this quiet chamber, the empire stirs. Telegrams flash across oceans announcing the death of Victoria Regina Imperatrix. In Delhi and Cape Town, in Ottawa and Melbourne, governors and ministers pause to read the same brief message. The Queen is dead. Long live the King. The phrase is both ending and beginning, the precise pivot of history. For those within the house, time seems briefly suspended. Bertie, now Edward VII, remains beside his mother, his expression a careful blend of grief and duty. He knows that ceremonies, councils, and declarations will follow. But for a few hours, he allows the private son to remain before the public king must emerge. Family members stand in quiet clusters, sharing the soft disbelief that even a life so long and monumental can finally be complete. Outside the window, the Solent glimmers under a thin winter sun. Ships continue their slow passage, sails and smokestacks outlined against the pale horizon. Life moves forward as it always does. The Queen's reign has ended, but the century she helped define is only beginning to reveal its own complexities. By evening, word reaches every corner of Britain. In London, crowds gather before Buckingham Palace, and the great cathedral bells toll in slow cadence. Some weep. Others simply stand in thoughtful silence, aware that they have lived through something unrepeatable. Children who once knew only the steady presence of Victoria now watch their parents absorb the weight of change. At Osborne, the rooms grow quiet again after the flurry of official messengers. Candles burn low around the Queen's chamber. Outside, the tide turns beneath the moon, a familiar and endless rhythm. Servants who have spent their entire lives in royal service move softly through the halls, their grief expressed in small, precise gestures. A straightened chair, a carefully folded curtain, a final bow at the doorway. The reign that began with a young woman barely 18 has closed with a world-spanning empire, an industrial revolution, and a century's worth of quiet endurance. Victoria's life, steady, sometimes stubborn, rarely sentimental, has become the very measure of the era that bears her name. And now, with a calm that seems almost deliberate, that era exhales. The sea outside keeps its timeless conversation with the shore. A faint mist rises, catching the glow of the setting sun. For a moment the horizon seems to blur, as though history itself pauses to mark the passing of a sovereign who became more than a symbol, who became, in the minds of her subjects, a constant. Then the tide resumes its eternal pull, and night settles once more over the Isle of Wight.